Kelsey, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate you taking some time to talk to me. We're going to be chatting about NACL, LCS, Amateur, League of Legends. But for those who may not know you, why don't you give a little bit of an introduction and your background?
Yeah, my name is Kelsey Moser. I've done a bunch of different jobs in the esports scene, but most recently, over the past 5 years of my career, I've mostly been focused on North American Developmental League primarily, doing a lot of positions in that space, either working on educational content with previously the EG gaming programs like youth gaming and then the collegiate stuff that we did while also coaching. I coached for 100 Thieves Academy. I did some coaching for Evil Geniuses, both their Prodigies and Academy team. And then I ended up taking over as head of coaching staff last year, and then coaching on stage with Respawn for the second half of the split. And then probably between then, within all of those years, I also ran the Academy production, like the NA Academy product. Before then, I was primarily a content creator. I did coach in EU for a little bit, and that's about it.
Awesome. Yeah, when I first met you was I think at 100 Thieves Academy. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, you've always been really heavily involved with the previously Academy, now amateur slash NACL scene. What do you think pulled you towards the developmental side of league more than trying for LCS and stuff like that?
I think one of the things that was the most interesting to me was just the reaction of people to, and this started also because I followed the Chinese LPL very closely, and I heard a lot of horror stories of like what the kind of mass importing of Korean players did to the infrastructure
Hmm.
there in terms of like how certain players were treated differently, XYZ, and then seeing it also happening in Europe and China, or in Europe and North America. And I thought it was very interesting in NA also because you saw the rate of player promotion was just extremely low.
Hmm.
And there was a lot of turnover of players coming in or things like this. And the question became kind of why is that? Like, why is the space like this? Why don't we have a higher promotion rate? And then, of course, there's a lot of answers to that question, but doing the best you can to kind of help out the scene, because for me, it's just more rewarding to see players kind of get to the part where they're competing at the top level from the beginning, rather than just kind of helping players who kind of already have a mindset, have an established way that they think they know how to win. That kind of process is just feels like more rewarding for coaches, and I think, well, at least me, it kind of depends on what kind of coach you are. So
Yeah.
that's where I am.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the narrative, right? Like seeing a player
Yeah.
develop from, probably some of people's favorite storylines were two players you were actually very involved with, right? Jojo Pune, some of the players coming up through that system and EG. It's great to see them kind of step on stage and succeed after coming up from basically homegrown talent. What do you think has kind of changed? Oh, well, look, for context too, what years were you in China or focusing on China?
So I did a lot of content creation around the LPL, starting primarily in early 2014,
Hmm.
very end of 2013.
Okay.
But lived in China for the better part of 2016, 2017, which is kind of like after the first year of what people call the Korean Exodus. That was a very interesting time because you could be on the ground, you could talk a lot to players, you could talk to staff and people like that. So it was very interesting, just kind of hearing their insights and their thoughts, and then also just looking out because I also was in Berlin for a bit too because I covered Europe as well, and then just seeing similarities and combining those things. And I think it's a very fun experience to kind of experience different cultures through the lens of League of Legends.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was interesting.
It's a universal language in another sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Did you ever learn Chinese?
Yeah. I used to speak it decently well, like conversational, keep up pretty well, watch Chinese shows and stuff. Then I came and started coaching in NA, and I stopped using it altogether. So part of my project now that I am currently kind of between things is getting a lot of that back, and then taking the HSK5 for Chinese Mandarin fluency. So yeah, that's sort of what I'm working on right now.
That is very impressive. I grew up I grew up speaking Chinese, and I've told people my whole life, don't try to learn Chinese because
it's
it is
interesting. Yeah.
it's one of the hardest languages in the world to even like begin to comprehend in my mind. But no, that's awesome. And then do you think that, well, clearly stuff has changed because in those years China was not the powerhouse that we're kind of used to seeing now in LPL. Do you think that it had to do with the training systems and the scouting, et cetera, that kind of stuff shifting, or is it more just this was an inevitability with the player base that they have?
So yeah, when I went into covering China, I usually kind of felt like it was inevitability with the player base. There are a lot of challenges in Chinese league that people don't talk about, and obviously I'm not the most equipped to talk about them, but I have heard them secondhand. Things like ping and internet quality is actually pretty poor in China as well. I remember like a few Korean players famously saying they refused to play SoloQ in China for very similar reasons as it happens in NA, right?
Yeah.
So there's that element, and I think, but for me, it always felt like it was inevitable that China would be competitive because of the player base, and because of a lot of things from there. And I think there's a few developmental things that happened, but they've always sort of been pretty big on their developmental scene. I remember I did this conversation with Nelson, who coached for XL for a bit, and he also coached for LNG. And there was like just talking about the differences in how Scouting Grounds was run in NA and Scouting Grounds was run in LPL was just very interesting because it's like almost a month-long program. You bring the players into the individual team gaming houses. You have a more kind of functional draft first pick sort of league setup, and then you do end up having those players as part. End up having to sign one of those players as part of your dev program every year for this scouting grounds for participation. So it was very interesting to hear just like the differences in investment, how many teams have like these training programs, and obviously you have to call out the difference in salary requirement, the difference in just like all of those things, and
Like
yeah,
for context,
it gets
it was also
complicated. But yeah,
they were able to bring on academy players for much less than So for anyone who's not aware, our salaries for academy were very, very high compared to what most other regions have. And then do you think that do they have any sort of system in place for coaches too, like coach development?
So this was another interesting thing. The coaching interview process was much more rigorous. Like you kind of get flown out for a month. You work with their academy team. They give you a trial period, and then they decide to sign you or not. It's very, but obviously you get to that element like later on in the process. I don't know how much work is done to kind of train or develop coaches. I didn't hear as much about it, but I did hear a lot about different coach like training processes and things like that. Obviously that's not every team and it's not every coach. Like if you're a big name, they'll put a lot of fun things in your contract for you and sign you immediately, but just like everywhere else.
Sure. Superstars. I've always felt like that was kind of a lacking part of the NA system, even when we had academy coaches, where it didn't seem like they tended to promote into their own staff. It felt like if you were really, really good in academy as a coach, you might get signed to another team, but then you're going into a whole new system, whole new players, like all this stuff. And I always felt like that was sort of a lacking, pipeline as well. Now let's talk about NA a little bit. Like, what do you think about the NA system now compared to academy? Now that we have NACL and no direct link between that level and tier 1.
It's definitely feels like NA of the major regions at this point now for sure has the least developmental programming, or the least supported developmental programming in tier 2 and tier 3. And I don't think that that's like controversial to say. It's pretty obvious.
Well, there is no program. Yeah. Essentially, it's like you throw all these teams into the pit and just see who survives. Like,
and I think a significant part of the NACL product right now that people don't really talk about is now it's kind of considered a separate league, and the emphasis is much more on revenue generation and not getting relegated, right? Keeping your spot for visibility.
Hmm.
which is not like the academy product had a very different purpose in
Right.
theory. And then before that, you had the Challengers League product, which was about promoting teams directly to the LCS. So
Yeah.
right now, very suddenly, the NACL doesn't serve a clear purpose, and it's kind of trying to find its identity again, and that's a big issue. Whereas I think in LPL you had a lot of controversy around the developmental league. Like, don't get me wrong, with the match fixing scandals XYZ, but I have like direct promotion. Several teams making the decision this year to directly promote their CAD teams and maintain their CAD teams. You have basically like the training programs under the academy teams, and it is just a lot cheaper to run, obviously, than how we were running our academy teams. But it's definitely quite different to see the changes in like roster building in some of the LPL orgs. Like EDG is a very famous one. They're bottom tier, they're last place right now, and everyone thinks isn't EDG good, but they just promoted like 3 academy players, right? So,
Right. Right.
um, yeah, it's very interesting to see the differences in how some teams are approaching roster building because of having
Yeah.
those systems.
Well, and I think it's sort of reflective of when you have salary issues, right? So
Mm-hmm.
everyone's kind of dealing with it right now.
Yep.
It's not just North America. When you have salary issues, this is what happens in other pro sports because they have an actual salary cap. Is that good teams don't stay good forever? They tend to cycle, and they understand that hey, this
Yep.
is maybe a cyclical thing where we need to promote some players where we're going to lose for a split or two. But then ideally, if you can find those
Yep.
diamonds in development, then hey, the next 3 years we're winning worlds, and that's sort of I think the right move from a longevity perspective, rather than continually trying to build super teams and just win now, win now, win now. It doesn't really make sense. Do you think that there are ways to better integrate NACL with LCS?
Yeah, for sure there are. I think the first most immediate thing for me is how drastically we went from basically 100 to 0, which is team
Mm-hmm.
spending a lot on housing in LA, in person, stuff like this.
Mm-hmm.
And even with all of that, like I don't think I'm able to share the specific numbers, but there was like money saved year over year on potential salaries that EDG or EG, excuse me, could have spent on a roster or would have spent on a roster if they didn't promote JoJo and Danny, even with the cost of the Acad team.
Sure.
Now your cost of your NACL team is much lower, like
Right.
significantly lower. So from my perspective, you're looking at LCS teams who are spending on the upper end. And the criticism, I guess, like for me, the scrutiny is why don't they have like a remote cat team? Because right now the value
Yeah.
that a team like FlyQuest is getting is very huge.
It,
Like teams that cut base salaries for LCS players, less so, like 100 Thieves, etc. But teams at the top that are still spending a decent amount, you save so much money by having one now. So that's
yeah.
step one.
Well, especially since a lot of the
Yeah.
LCS teams, or not a lot, I should say, a couple have gone the route of why don't we just partner with one of these amateur teams
Mm-hmm.
and we'll provide them with some resources. We'll still have a sort of direct relationship with certain teams. I feel like that's a
Yep.
pretty fair compromise, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
I know some teams have stated that they're going to do certain things. We haven't seen anything from them yet, and there's almost no
Yep.
involvement, no investment in the scene. And I think Riot or the LCS as a whole should sort of mandate some sort of involvement. Otherwise, the scene will die, and that's what everyone's fear was when they first announced it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if we're not going to support NACL, then if half the teams are supporting NACL, how can you justify the money that you just saved? Where's that money going now? Um,
Yeah. I
so
also think the other element is just integrating collegiate better. And
mhm,
this is a controversial tweet because colleges will say we don't care, right, about NACL, but even the ones who want to compete at the high level will still compete in OQs, and
mhm,
they have the stretched schedule of competing in NACL and in or OQs and their own college league. And it says there our investors don't care, but I think there are ways to make collegiate investors kind of care about NACL by highlighting collegiate storyline.
that was something I did want to ask you
Um,
about. Is
yeah,
I'm a big proponent of collegiate path to
yeah.
pro. That's sort of been the model in every other sport in the U.S.
Mhm.
because, like you mentioned, we are at the end of the day a capitalist society, and there is no free lunch. So everybody somehow has to generate revenue, and I think college is one of the better places to do that because they already have funding. They have
Yeah.
earmarked funding for their sports programs and all that. So uh, talking about current NACL, like how do you feel about Maryville kind of stepping up and actually winning a bunch of games?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because the expectation was that these rosters with star names would do better initially, but I think you're seeing the result of teams that actually work on team play for a consistent amount of time and have like a pre-established way to play winning early. So
Mm-hmm.
you have the success of um, Wildcard also out of the bat, and that's 4 of 5 St. Louis University
Yeah.
players on that roster. You have the successes of Maryville as well.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, Maryville has at this point played fewer series, and then we saw Wildcard lose their first series to DSG
Mm-hmm.
at this point. So I think that there's definitely like over time you should expect to see the I guess I don't want to call them super teams, but the newer rosters
There's definitely different tiers.
yeah, the newer rosters performing better.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I think it's fair to expect those teams to start out. But I think it's a good sign as well
Yeah.
because in the past we've had those teams even with pre-existing synergy not do well, and I do think a lot of it just is as a result of lower time investment that tier two players are able to put into this. Like I talked to the players, most of them are going to school or doing a job on the side, right?
Right.
At this point, which
Right.
was in the past not the standard for tier two. Um, and then it's just not affordable to support yourself playing tier two league. So it's definitely one of those things where, okay, if you're able to go to, if everyone's going to college or doing a part-time job anyway, the teams that are kind of on site together, the teams that are kind of playing together all the time should be the ones that have the advantage, right? So that's kind of the way that I see it, and I think it's good for the scene that it is playing out that way.
Yeah.
Um, my one thing, and I haven't researched this perfectly, is just on the budget of collegiate because
Mm-hmm.
they say you're earmarked for sports, but a lot of times, you're basically being subsidized by like your football boosters. This
Right.
isn't necessarily true of every single program because I haven't investigated every single program, but a lot of esports programs are. And that's always my big concern because I come from like the esports journalism background where it says
Mm-hmm.
it's okay, the esports vertical, it's subsidized by sports or it's subsidized by whatever. So that's my concern on it because
Mm-hmm.
I mean that was the academy program too, right?
Yeah.
It's like
We,
oh the
we
academy program is subsidized by XYZ. So yeah,
Right. We have seen a little bit of fallout on the collegiate side as well. Some of the
yeah.
universities that had scholarships, stuff like that, ended up having to drop their programs. But as a whole, I do think the product is more marketable from the college standpoint.
It's more intuitively understandable. Yeah.
Yeah, and just the fandom, right? Like if
Mhm.
you are from a school, even if you never heard of the team, but you're like, well, I mean, I support my school, and it turns out they have a League of Legends team, and I play League, like, cool, I'm a fan.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a little bit of an easier fan base to build off of. But one of the secondary benefits, I think, too, from the previous
Mhm.
academy system dissolving was that there's all of a sudden this excess of very, very skilled players that flooded the
Yeah.
market. And a lot of them got picked up by universities. So overnight, sort of in the last year, the overall competition level of the top end of collegiate drastically improved. A lot of coaching staffs improved, a lot of players improved. So I think long term, that's actually a good thing for the scene. We're going to see better competition, and that was always the biggest criticism of collegiate from other high elo players I talked to was that, well, they're just not good enough to really
Mhm.
compete with academy. And so I think we're starting to see more of that shift. I think like you said, SLU, Maryville, like it's a good sign that they're actually competing against NACL teams fairly well.
Yep.
Hopefully that continues, and that should also make some of maybe the players that aren't coming from LCS or Academy, but also help them improve in
Yep.
collegiate by itself. So
I think it's very interesting because obviously the global sports scene really thinks Americans suck at sports, and I think that that's fair in a lot of cases. They'll say things like the only sports Americans are good at are sports only Americans play, but sports like it's not true, right? Because like sports where we have high school programs, we actually
Yeah.
do compete really well at
Yeah.
international
I mean,
levels. Like,
I
we
think
have big
most,
swimming teams,
yeah,
we
yeah,
have wrestling teams, and we actually do pretty well in those
yeah.
sports.
Yeah. I
So
mean,
yeah.
I actually, I can't think of an international sport that we don't do fairly well. And people use soccer, but that's not even true anymore. You know,
Mhm.
we
So
actually perform very well now that due to the popularity of World Cup, soccer players have become more normalized. Like we're seeing a lot more high level soccer players playing in Premier League, you know, like
and
from the US.
the history of that one is also very interesting because soccer was kind of originally marketed as a women's sport
Mm-hmm.
in the
Mm-hmm.
U.S., which is, and we've always had a very good women's
Yeah, yeah,
team.
we've had the best women's team in the world for decades.
So yeah, yeah, but it was originally it's like marketed as a sport that girls can play too,
Yeah.
and it's not that way in like Europe. So it's very interesting that we have had that dichotomy. But if you look at kind of the history of soccer in the U.S., it's very interesting
Yeah.
from that perspective.
I
Yeah.
mean, anytime they're like, "Oh, well, Americans just aren't athletic," it's like, well, our best athletes are going to the sports that pay the most, which is not soccer. You know, it's football,
Mhm.
basketball, baseball. Like, you know, if you had a chance to play professional baseball or professional soccer, which are you going to pick? Like,
Yeah,
so
of course.
yeah, and so in the same way too, I also feel the same about league, right? People are like, "Oh, North
Mhm.
American solo queue is always going to be a detriment," but it's mainly because we don't have enough players playing, right?
Yeah, that's a big part of it. Hmm.
Yeah, like if we had double the player base, then it's twice as competitive. To get to challenger, you have to be
Yep.
like twice as good. So, yeah, so it's been another thing. So with some of those disadvantages, then, like, what are some things that you've experienced in the last few years in your career that you found how are we trying to bridge the gap? Like, how are we trying to
Yeah,
develop players and teams?
and I think you talked about this a bit with your LS show,
Hmm.
and this is something that I've kind of always maintained as well. Is just because when you talk to like staffs and other ecosystems or players in other ecosystems, they have a lot of the same callouts about coaches that we've had many years ago, which is that coaching staff don't do anything, right? They're basically just glorified babysitters, XYZ.
Hmm.
But the I think so. Like you kind of have to bridge the solo queue gap with either staff or other resources
Hmm.
because I always maintain that you get punished for basic things when you're playing in Korean solo queue, right? You get punished for playing your matchup suboptimally. In the
Hmm.
US or in NA solo queue, you go and you egregiously overextend your lane or you misposition and the jungler just like farms and your enemy mid laner just sits there and tries to last hit creeps at like 50% rate or whatever. And then, but so just the attitude that fans have of imitating Korea by mindlessly grinding doesn't work because you
Yeah,
don't get the same like punishment feedback mechanism.
right.
But having like an investment in coaching staff or having an investment in an ability to see pro views from other regions, like I think the LPL pro view is like such a great resource because it's one of the only regions that still has that freely accessible.
Hmm.
Um, is amazing to kind of sit with a player, go over the VOD, talk to them about like the thought process of the player, like what they take from it, what's good, what's bad, those types of things, because it ends up being learning league and the NA ends up being like a much more visualization based process rather than a repetition based process to an extent. So it's a very interesting and unique challenge. And I think the development and coaching staff, as LS mentioned, is a good direction.
Hmm.
Obviously, it's easy for me to say that because I'm a coach. But even like without that, I think that there's an interesting situation because I think a lot of teams have kind of given up on finding good coaches. But um,
That should be the best
also,
investment you can make.
I mean,
You're improving
in
five
theory,
players at
right?
once,
I don't know.
right?
Like even if I'm not getting hired, right?
Yeah,
Hire a good coach, right? So
right.
that's all I'm saying.
Well, I think you not only have theory, but you've demonstrated, right? Like last year, EG's roster on paper, I don't think a lot of people would have put them top four.
I think a lot of credit for that still goes to JoJo, though, in
Sure,
my opinion, because I
phenomenal
think,
player, yeah.
especially the way he was performing in spring,
Hmm.
no one expected him to be the literal MVP of the league in summer.
You know what's funny? I
I
remember
just still remember some games.
I remember talking to him actually early in
Yeah,
the split, and I told him, I
yeah.
was like, "Oh, how are you feeling about the split? Whole new team. You don't have your buddies. Inspired gone, Vulcan's gone." He's like, "I'm gonna carry this year." I'm like, "Okay,
Mhm.
I'm waiting to see it." He's like, "I'm gonna carry. Watch," and
Yeah.
he showed up. Like he's the goat.
Yeah. So I think a lot of the credit goes to that, but also the rest of the team as well. I
Well,
think you're
yeah.
seeing like obviously Unforgiven and Revenge are currently teamless, but I
Yeah.
think you're seeing like 100 Thieves still punching above their weight.
Mm-hmm.
IMT
Mm-hmm.
doing great things, and I
Mm-hmm.
think like Armeo Ayla have great things to show.
Mm-hmm.
They're very kind of disciplined, self-motivated players, and I'm like I think we just got super lucky that from our scouting, it's like these players were teamless. We put together an awesome team from kind of like the cream of the crop that got overlooked.
Uh,
So I think that's like a great for me, I will always like give credit back to the players because they were
yeah.
great.
I
Yeah.
mean, and Razvan, right? Like being able
Yeah.
to step in as a coach for the first time, essentially.
Yep.
Well, not as a head coach for the
An
first
on
time.
yeah, an
Yeah.
on stage coach. Yeah.
Yeah. How did you feel about, right now, obviously JoJo's struggling a little bit. I wouldn't say struggling personally as a player, but like as a team, C9
Yeah.
doesn't look quite as polished as we expected. Um, do you think that it's maybe just new environment, new coaching staff? I mean, he's grown up in the EG system and now he's in a whole new place.
Yeah, I think that could be part of it, but I also my biggest question mark about that roster was how Blabber and JoJo would work together,
Hmm.
because a lot of people are pointing out kind of that Blabber's not using his lane advantages, but even last year he was sort of not doing that. Like that was one thing we noted in a lot of our initial scouting, and then we had our series where I think the casters joked like I've never seen a series before where it feels like a team won 3 games and they lost 3 games. Where at time it felt like that in the series, but it was just because our junglers was working like very well with our laners, and
Hmm.
C9's formula was much more everyone kind of amass an individual lead and team fight very well together.
Hmm.
And I think that JoJo, the way he likes to play the lane, to me it was very funny watching the IMT series because Armeo knows like the windows that JoJo will want to play on the Tristana matchup, and he's going forward and he's doing for his mid
I
laner what he used to
Yeah,
do for JoJo, just like
yeah.
putting a bush down, like putting a shield and then walking away, and then it's just like very great to see that kind of
It,
dynamic. So
it's got to be annoying.
yeah.
It's got to be annoying for him.
So it's just like an element of because I think one thing that C9 did really well last year that people don't really talk about is their level ones were they would always have wards in the enemy jungle level 1 on both sides, and it was easy to like sweep or you could try to create strategies around that, but it made it very easy for one of the lanes to play and the jungle to also just not necessarily have to do as much.
Mhm.
So I think that that's something that teams kind of have noticed and adapted to, and also it's harder to consistently have in draft like strong level 1 on both sides of the map and to get an advantage where you can get wards on both sides. So I think that that's something that would be very interesting to do in comparison to between the C9 and last summer
Yeah,
C9.
and something that I talked about preseason too was I
Mhm.
think the volatility this season is going to be higher than usual, just with the map changes. Like a lot of the whole game feels very different, and there's no preseason, so it just feels like there's supposed to be more volatility than normal right now. So I'm not super
Yep.
surprised by some of the standings. It's more surprised than I should be, but yeah. And then so I guess with JoJo, then, well, we don't have to talk too much about JoJo himself, but do you feel like what are some of the hallmark signs that you saw in JoJo as a player? Obviously, it wasn't just
Yep.
you, like Peter Dunn, all that.
Yeah, a lot of people.
Yeah,
Mhm.
like what were some of the hallmark signs that you saw in him as a player that you felt like, hey, this kid might be special. We need to give him a chance.
So, like in off season, and this is something that like Papa Smith is in the chat.
Hmm.
We kind of worked on a lot in 100 Thieves too, and then that we also had in EG to an extent was it's very important to watch a lot of VODs and to kind of try to use the same metrics to an extent that you can with the eye test,
Hmm.
like make categories in your brain, measure players against like measure players against each other and their potential performances, and so like do a very thorough VOD sample, etc. And it was just watching JoJo's individual performances in Academy versus like potential players we could have gotten. Like Humanoid was in the conversation, players like this. It was just there was just an innate way that he was playing skirmishes and fights in the lane that was just okay. Well, he actually like you don't even have to make a stretch and say that he's going to be better by X amount of time. He actually is just better in these areas. And that's probably a controversial thing to say because obviously Humanoid's a great player, but it was just kind of crazy because multiple members of the staff just came to the same conclusion watching the VODs. And that includes like Nasser, who's now at FlyQuest Empire, and also Turtle, who was coaching in Brazil now and was coaching EG. So.
Yeah, shout out to Papa Smithy. I actually talked about him on my stream, I think yesterday or the day before. He's had a good track record of identifying talent, both 100 Thieves, you know, and FlyQuest now. You know, 100 Thieves Academy has a bunch of players that, you know, arguably should be starting somewhere. They're all doing very well in NACL now. So, yeah, still work to do, obviously. But
Yeah.
I think, are there outside of game traits that you also identified, or is it mostly just focused on the eyeball test of watching them play?
I mean, so for me over the years, the biggest thing for me is getting a better way to understand how they are in an interpersonal level, which is sometimes difficult based on interview processes, things like that. So standardizing those is also important.
Mm-hmm.
Like the eyeball test is very huge, but for me, I think this is something that I've learned to value more and more over time is how is this player going to affect the team? And if you are listening to some of my NACL commentary, I speak highly of Chad and Winnie, even though they don't necessarily pass like insane levels of eye test. Just because when you play on a team with these junglers, you always know like what the plan is. And I think that that's really important. And you need a player like that on almost every team.
Yeah.
So I think that that's something that I'm learning over time to integrate a lot more into my scouting and my process of understanding like good talent and what will make a good roster. And I think, I mean, I've been like part of building very successful rosters, right?
Yeah.
I was part of the 100 Thieves process with like really great people there, and I was part of the EG process. So for me, it's like constantly iterating on and getting a better idea of what will make teams function even better together. So yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and it's really showed. There's certain teams in the league that
Mm-hmm.
obviously prioritize development, and I think it's great. It should be the way forward. Nice thing is we are seeing that more also from other teams now. You know, a lot of the players that are actually popping off now are previous academy talent, right? Like Insanity's been playing pretty well. Yeah, there's just a lot more parity, I think, at that level, which is great. And also, I guess with, you know, sort of the budget recession, budget cuts, and all that, importing has become a much more uh what's the word, there's a much more direct reason to import now than, oh, let's just find the best possible player
Yeah,
and plug him in. It's like you really need to have a reason to import someone into a role.
it's interesting though because I would also argue that like IMT is a good example of this. It's actually in some cases more cost efficient to import
Right.
because and this is like part of the scene bias, if you will. Like if you tell a random NA player, you know, I'm gonna have you play with like Chad Jungle or whoever, you know, Chad Jungle or maybe Dark Wings or whoever you want, right? Anyone at all.
Mhm.
And then they'll say, oh, well, that guy just ints me in SoloQ or he just types too much or whatever. But if you say, oh, we're getting a Korean juggler or a Korean mid, they'll be like, oh, that sounds good. And then you talk to sometimes the Korean player, it's like, oh, they just want to play tier one. So they'll agree to like an LCS mid salary.
Right.
Right. So sometimes it just becomes like, to an extent, more cost efficient.
I've always thought, yeah, it's a really interesting dynamic that's kind of specific to esports, is the fact that
Yeah.
these players sort of know each other outside of the
Mm-hmm.
professional realm and not oftentimes on very good terms. Like, there's definitely a lot
Yeah.
of drama in the high elo community because they, you know, you have to play both with these people and against these people, and
Mm-hmm.
you know, sometimes you have a bad day, sometimes they have a good day, sometimes they are just having a bad outside of game day and they decide to type at you. And
Yeah.
um yeah, it's interesting how you have to sort of juggle that with also being a professional.
It's weird because I think a lot of times players will have bias for the unknown, just because they also, it's easy to do so because you get the immediate value of seeing LCK win worlds. So
Right.
there must be something in the solo queue or in the water there, so the standard players is better in your mind, right? And I'm not saying that this is like all players' faults, right, or anything, but sometimes it is actually, when you are hurting for money, sometimes it is more cost efficient to import.
That makes
And I
sense.
think that that's a little bit underrated when you see a lot of the roster making decisions that happen in this offseason. So yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think we've sort of moved away from the
Yeah.
$5 million import mid now. It's like
Hmm.
we're kind of going more towards, okay, well, did they plug a hole? Maybe you just couldn't find a
Yeah.
mid laner that
Mhm.
was at an LCS level at the time. So it's like, well, if we import, it's a little bit more of a long shot, but it might work out better, and they might have a higher ceiling than some of
Yeah.
the NACL talent you could have promoted. But do you have any players that you're specifically looking at right now out of NACL that might be able to make a jump in next split?
Yeah. I mean, I think they're like obviously a good part of the Fly Challengers team.
They're doing pretty well.
We're gonna do my LCS team.
Yeah.
So like Serdi, Shaden, I think they're very talented
Hmm.
players. I think Serdi is one of those players who like wasn't immediately on my radar, but he's made himself like an incredible top laner
Hmm.
just by his dedication, his work ethic, his like attitude, and the way he thinks about the game, and then just has improved his mechanics like through that as well. So like he's definitely one of those players that made me realize that you need to for sure value these things, because I think at first like I had a huge bias: if you can't play team fights, you can't do X. But
Hmm.
Serdi's laning has always been good, and his team fights have gotten like much more phenomenal over
Hmm.
the years in terms of his ability to play those out. Um, and then of course Shaden is more the traditional, like watch him play solo queue and you're like, this guy is insane, like
Yeah.
sign him immediately. So yeah, I think that those are great examples. I think other good examples that I have my eye on are like Toasty Alex is a really talented mid, and he doesn't have like the same quality. He has some good out of game qualities as well. Like he's already able, willing, and able to step up and take leadership role at like 17. And you see him look more for angles. I think his laning, once he improves his laning, he'll be like doing pretty well. I mean, you can shout at a player on so many teams. I think like obviously Tenacity and Poom, those are players
Yeah.
that I'm familiar with. Players who have had showings in LCS already.
I think,
Like you
yeah.
see, yeah,
Tenacity's specific situation is kind of just unfortunate timing. I feel like just
yeah.
it's just a weird situation for him, but he's playing well. So hopefully he gets another shot. What are some things that you think are generally lacking in players coming out of tier 2, tier 3?
Yeah, I think it really depends, right? I think this was something that like it was Cubby's stream, and he was trying to have a conversation about what would you rather a player out of tier two have, like an already understanding of fundamentals, or on an individual level, or team play. It's like you kind of need one or the other, so you're not completely playing catch up.
Hmm.
I think the the big thing for me is just like, what do they often lack is just the patience to visualize winning the game when they're not ahead. And I think that that's something that you don't learn, because the way that you get scouted for a pro team is by doing well in solo queue, and the
Right.
only way you win solo queue is by consistently relying on your own lead.
That's
Um,
always been my issue with
so
how
yeah.
League works with solo queue is that the game of solo queue is fundamentally different than competitive.
Hmm.
Like you get upset when you're weak sided in solo queue and you hard win your lane, but in pro it's like you're supposed to
Yeah.
lose. You're supposed to lose that lane. Like it should just play out the way it is. But it's like I think it's really hard I've noticed that too. A lot of amateur, going into rookie year players
Mhm.
really struggle with just accepting that they sometimes have to lose, like, especially in certain roles. Uh, I guess would you? Well, here's a question that I recently did an interview with Supernova, and we were talking about: would you rather have a player coming in on a team? I
Yeah.
guess it depends on the team, but coming in who's very very good at laning, or someone who's very very good at team fighting, like working with the team,
Yeah.
I should say.
I mean, it really depends on what you feel more comfortable coaching, in my opinion, or what you think is harder to learn. And I do think it is variable player to player. But I think it is very difficult to kind of learn to track the variables in team fighting, um, more so than to learn to lane. Because I think laning is a lot more about consistency and repetition and playing. Like it's the longer the game goes, the more variables and changes you kind of add.
I see.
But the first several waves often play out the same way
That makes
every
sense.
game.
So learning to lane is a much more objective thing.
So for me, it's a lot easier to learn to. I think team fighting is like to an extent also objective, but there's just in the split of the moment, you have to pay attention to so many different variables, react to so many different things that could be
Yeah.
unexpected.
Yeah.
Whereas with when you get to lane, level one, okay, my spell does this amount of damage, your spell does this amount of damage, my auto attack has this range. I can get this many autos in general for yours if you walk forward, right?
Yeah.
So you can kind of break it down in a much with fewer variables and in a much more standard way starting from the beginning, and it's easier to get to a point where you're getting leads at that point. So for me, I think it's easier to have players learn to lane than to team fight, but I
That
think
makes
both
sense.
can be
Yeah.
done. Yeah.
Or even macro, right? Like macro is such a fluid thing, and oftentimes can be sort of chaotic. Like that's why actually I love seeing some of the debates on Twitter and stuff like that when coaches will discuss macro decisions. It's very subjective actually, right? Like it's always like sort of, well, what's
Sometimes it is.
better, you know? So that stuff is for sure harder to teach because you're almost trying to teach a philosophy rather than teach something specific like laning. Like, oh, this is how the first three levels of this matchup should go.
Yeah, I think it also depends, right? Because I had this conversation recently on stream too, where it's like you could do certain cheeses in lane
Mm-hmm.
that get you leads that people might not expect, but you can't do them again, right? Like starting a weird ability or whatever,
Right.
and then just jumping on them, things like that. But there's also it depends on who you ask about macro because people will be very contentious. Like this is objectively the best play that can be made here, but also in macro you have way more time to plan, right?
Right.
You're coming out of base and everyone's got their resets and their items in an ideal world, and you're talking in base about where you want to go,
Right.
right? Whereas in the team fights, it's like, oh shit, this guy just flashed at me, like I need to
Right.
react or not,
Right.
and I need to be anticipating the flash or not when my team is talking about more team wide things. So for me, it's more about like how do you react on the fly? How do you think about things on the fly? And you can do pre-planning for team fights for sure because you can always keep in mind when you're going to dragon or whatever what flashes are up, what cooldowns do I want to save my spells for, like in an ideal world. But
Right.
there's just way more random shit that can happen.
Sure, sure. I mean, I wonder if there's a difference in whether it's just solo queue as a whole, like in the East, how their team fighting just seems so intuitive,
Mhm.
and because they're probably used to playing like that in solo queue all the time, versus in NA when you watch like NA teams fight, there's like just mechanical errors you don't tend to see in
Yes.
like LPL LCK teams. Um,
Yeah.
you think that's a solo queue issue or more of a scrim slash training issue?
So I mean, I will mention ping
Yeah,
briefly,
right.
but it does like this is where traditionally you saw more like NA mage players than assassin players because it's
Right,
easier
right.
to use your ball and
Well,
or to use your spells and like judge range when you're far away instead of when you're hurtling yourself bodily towards the enemy team, right, or
yeah.
whatever. You have like less time. So as a result, you're also spending more time practicing like putting yourself on the edge, in like higher level solo queue or in lower ping solo queue. I'm not going to say ping is everything, but it is a factor in
Yeah.
those areas.
No, and actually,
Um,
I had a
yeah,
conversation with Golden Glue way back, and he mentioned,
yep,
when well, now he's obviously a LCS coach, but when he was a
yep,
player, he said, well, the ping indirectly starts to affect a lot more than just your
yep.
mechanics because you don't
Mm-hmm.
trust your ability to team fight like that. You start not taking certain fights because
Mm-hmm.
the only way I'm winning this is if I can mechanically outplay this. And so you just choose not to even go into the scenario. And he said
Yep,
that that's one of the main reasons for a long time why LCS looked so slow and tentative compared to LPL LCK. It's like a sort of this subconscious result of ping. He's like
yep,
you don't trust your mechanics the same way, so you can't take these fights.
yep, absolutely. I also think when you have more players who are kind of pushing themselves to their limits. Like you think about, oh, I didn't realize you could play that situation that way. Like you study it in the VOD, and then now that's like a situation that might occur in your head. That's why like players like Caps, players like the Shy, players like Naguri, they were always like kind of called inters. Like UZI or Uzi is another famous one, right?
Yeah.
They were always like kind of called inters when they were coming up because they would always put themselves at the very limit of a situation, knowing that they could outplay it or believing in themselves to outplay it.
That's
I
just
think there
like me,
was a
except I'm not good.
well, but see, you're more likely to get good if you keep putting yourself in those scenarios. That's what I believe, at least.
Yeah.
So there you go. You know, you're on the right track.
Yeah.
Doc Respawn is Caps 3.0 or
One
whatever.
day. I'm slowly climbing. I'm just I'm at a different rate.
Yeah.
Cool. So I guess, well, now, I mean, you're currently not working with any teams, correct? So
Yes.
you're a free agent.
Well, I'm technically the Fly Challengers co-streamer, but that's
That,
the extent of
that's
my
what Papa Santa
affiliation.
keeps saying. So
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, well, luckily they're doing well. So
Yeah.
yeah, what are some plans for you going forwards? Any goals or
Yeah.
anything specific?
So kind of I have like some part-time stuff that's unrelated to League that I'm gonna probably be starting. For me, like I said, I'm very interested in the developmental scene for esports in general. So if an opportunity to work on the broader scene like that rises up, that's immediately number one on my list. Otherwise, I would love to like I'm considering like a bunch of different things, but producing was really fun, like all of those things. And for me, it's sort of just focusing on what I'm enjoying right now. And then when summer rolls around, if there's any like movement in anywhere, then maybe I'll look for something then. I'm also having a good time streaming right now. Um,
Yeah.
the LPL co-streamer crowd is a fun time for sure. So if anyone is up at those hours and wants to hang out and watch some LPL games, I'm pretty much streaming every night that LPL is on. So
Yeah, I really appreciate you taking time. I'm kind of in the same vein. I'm not working with any teams right now. So
yeah,
I took the opportunity to do more content, and I've been very, very invested in the developmental side for a long time. I love
great.
talking to academy players, and I've always tried to mentor them in terms of just like,
Mm-hmm.
not league, obviously I don't know league well enough, but as people, like, start
Yep,
getting into content creation, start promoting yourself.
yep,
Here's how
absolutely.
train more effectively, stop just grinding solo queue mindlessly. Like, I mean, the last year with talking to Soul, we had some really good conversations, just about training and philosophy towards that stuff. So I always appreciate everything you do for the scene. Obviously it's a pleasure working with you over a couple of teams. Yeah, and any last, I guess, suggestions or tips or advice for players who are either currently, in the open qualifiers or looking to maybe participate next time?
Yeah, I think probably for me the big thing for like Oki players is just keep keep focused because the time that you have to improve on the game is limited. So always have a goal in mind when you're playing solo queue. Don't like rage queue, things like that. And then as you mentioned, like get yourself out there, do content, brand value, like having people talk about you sometimes matters way more in the way that the scouting system works than anything else. So do your best to kind of network. Also, if you learned anything from this, it's like how you behave in solo queue will matter for how you get on teams because people will
Yeah,
talk about you, unfortunately. So always kind of keep that in mind too. So yeah.
absolutely. That's one of the biggest things is, when it comes down to actually getting signed to a pro roster, like your personality really matters. It's not just how good you are, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Hope you have a good rest of your evening, and I'll talk to you soon.
No, it's been great. Thank you. I hope you keep doing what you do and helping people out. So yeah.
Awesome. All right. Thank you. Take care. Bye.
Bye.